You're tuning in to the practice segment, where we talk about available tools you can use to practice this concept. So in this section of the podcast, we're going to try to go through some of the ways that you can combat these feelings of imposter syndrome. And for me, any kind of self-care always has to start with self-awareness. So even as I was going through the different types of imposter syndrome there, I was trying to find an example if that connects for me in my life. And within the different types of the imposter syndromes that I walked through, I can see how some of them are overstated and some of them I have an easier time with. So, for example, while the soloist might have been me earlier in my life, I really embrace connection and community, and I see asking for help or support or insights as being a way to foster that. And that has really been a very helpful gift for me in releasing the expectation of myself to do everything by myself. So that one for me doesn't get as overstated as some of the other ones. Or I also spoke about the expert, right? So using my own experience of being, the expert, but not having all the answers and having that be okay. And knowing that that doesn't mean that I am a fraud or that I'm a failure or that I'm letting somebody down. It just means I might have to get back to them or I might need to look into that. And that's okay. So those two in my own practice of self-reflection or self-awareness don't show up as the ones that I have a harder time with. I do struggle with the natural genius. I like to be good at things, and when I'm not good at things right away, I tend to put them away. And again, that's shown up in my life in a lot of ways that haven't served me and has excluded me from doing a lot of things that I want to do. So that is one that I am really working to put more attention to. And you can do this exact same type of practice, right? You can sit with a reflection of how those types of imposter syndrome show up for you. What are you saying to yourself? Which category of that do they fall into? Or maybe it's another one. And once you have the awareness of how the pattern is showing up in your life, then this is where you can work to challenge that. I can't believe it is escaping me right now, but there is a book by an author that I will have to find and put into the show notes who talks about cultivating a growth mindset and this idea of adding the word yet. So in my case, that might sound something like, I'm not a great driver yet, or I'm not fluent in that language yet, or I don't know how to sit in self-reflection or sit in my discomfort yet. And that yet is so powerful because it opens up a world of possibilities. And that can really cultivate courage to looking at what we can do in a situation versus what we can't do. And when it's something that we embrace that we just aren't good at yet or are working towards, it can also help us cultivate accountability buddies and support networks, people who are going to hold us accountable, people who we can share some of these maybe micro steps that we want to take to build up to a goal so that we feel comfortable. So again, using driving as an example, because that's one that's very relevant for me right now. That might be having an accountability buddy who I share that my goal for the day is to drive for 30 minutes or to drive in a certain area. So using myself as an example, I've now become quite comfortable driving in rural areas, but I live in a major metropolitan area where driving is a lot more stressful, and I am trying to build goals to progressively build up my comfort level. And I can do that and hold myself accountable by proclaiming these sorts of things as I have just done, which is also very scary because I feel like now people are going to listen to this and ask me how my driving's going. So I guess you're all part of my support network now, working with me to provide encouragement and guidance and maybe help me also practice that self-compassion by setting realistic goals so that I don't try to drive on a multi-lane 70-kilometer road the very first time I'm operating a vehicle. I don't know if I shared this or not, but one of my favorite things about that story, which again, I can laugh at now, did not laugh at then, but that driving instructor quit being a driving instructor after that day. And I don't I mean, there's so many reasons that could have been. So I'm not taking all of the credit, but there's a part of me that does believe that it was that driving experience where he just went, nope, this is not worth it. So yeah, so having a bit of that self-compassion when we set lofty goals and maybe don't meet them or are building up to them, and being able to sit back and ask myself questions like, what would I say to a friend in that situation? Which is one of my very favorite ways to practice self-compassion, because I'm quite naturally compassionate to other people. But like, oh boy, I am quite a jerk to myself. So if I was to do that in this example, I might say, well, no one really should have expected that you would have been able to do that on your first try. And maybe that driving instructor should have assessed you in the parking lot before putting you on a major road for everybody's safety. But we don't do that for ourselves as naturally as we would for a friend. So I always love that practice of self-compassion and also embracing failure. And the great one, who, if you've listened to the other segment of this podcast, you'll know is how this person has exclusively requested to be referred to in the podcast. So we'll see how far that goes. And I wonder how many people will try to figure out who the great one is. But the great one has been talking a lot recently about failing forward. And I do think there is a lot of benefit to failure. And I really believe that as a scientist as well. Although when an experiment didn't work out, it was crushing, because often you have, deadlines and you're trying to get ready to publish and do all kinds of things that you just don't really get a chance to do when your data fails. But there is an amazing essay, I think it was a convocation speech by Robert Feynman, called Cargo Cult Science. And it was I believe an essay that he presented at a commencement address in the early 70s. He actually talked about it, as I recall, as being about scientific integrity, about honesty, and part of that being eliminated when we don't share the failed experiments, because they're essentially eliminated from the literature base. So I always find that really interesting. And I really think there is value in sharing stories of how we have failed and what we have learned from them. I know some of the biggest and best lessons I have learned in my life, although many of them were quite painful, have come out of those failures. And in a culture where we are living with imposter syndrome, when we make it okay to say, I made a mistake, we make it safer, especially people in positions of power or influence. Because when we only ever show our successes, when we always show up as perfect, we communicate that as an impossible standard. It reminds me, and not to get on too much of a tangent, because this could be a whole thing all on its own, but my personal Instagram handle, not the handle part, but the comment, and this explanation tells you how much I know about social media, but the description, the bio, I think it's called, of my personal Instagram account is my curated life, because we're all curating versions we're putting out there of ourselves. And the reason I have that as my bio is because I think it can be easy to forget that sometimes, that the things we put out there, the ways we present to the outside world, are just one view of us. And if we had more obvious examples of missteps or failures, one, I think it would normalize it and make it safer for people to make them. Two, I think it would make it easier to be compassionate to ourselves. And three, I think we'd have fewer people questioning and doubting themselves and living this imposter syndrome in a way that hinders them. So those are a couple of the practices that you can do to challenge your imposter syndrome. And don't do it alone. This is one where sometimes having a sounding board or a trusted friend sharing observations about how you're doing on something, or sitting with you as you navigate some of those self-reflections about the types of imposter syndrome that might show up in your world, offering that same compassion you would to a friend to yourself, and maybe even doing this with a friend. Go through the types of imposter syndrome, reflect on if any of them show up in your life, share stories or experiences, and see how your friends react to you, what compassion they offer you, and also what joy and laughter you can find in some of these things. Because just like I can now sit back and sort of laugh at myself for expecting the natural genius to show up in things I'm literally just doing for the first time. When you're in that moment and we're in our heads, it can be hard to get out of that. So there's lots of different ways to keep going when it feels hard. And there are lots of reasons this may have shown up in your life. But at the root of this, imposter syndrome is all about the fear of being found out. And it's about not feeling like you belong. So I'm always a fan of talking. I will always be pro conversation. And I think one of the anecdotes that we can bring in to foster belonging is by sharing those vulnerabilities, is by sharing our mistakes, is by talking about how we fail forward, is by openly expressing when we have self-doubt and being aware of maybe where we're self-sabotaging our own successes, whether it's by setting unrealistic expectations or trying to do everything on our own and maybe burning out. But we get out of it by talking about it, by reflecting on it, by learning to laugh at it, by being compassionate, setting reasonable goals and adjusting those, and by leaning into kindness to ourselves and others. If you'd like to learn a couple more things you can do to lean into this concept, check out the bonus content posted. Please like, follow, and leave a 5-star review if you're enjoying this. Thanks for being part of this journey with me. This is Lil, and you're listening to Lil on Life. If you'd like to reach out, you can get me on my Gmail at lilonlifepod@gmail.com. That's Lil with one L, onlifepod@gmail.com. Or on my socials, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok at lilonlifepod. Lil on Life podcast is produced by Brando and Company. You can find his work on Instagram at Brandon Allen. Lil on Life is a Big B and Little L collaboration. Opinions expressed in this podcast are my own and may not reflect those of my employers. If you or someone you know is in danger, please dial 911. In Canada, if you or someone you know is thinking about suicide, call or text 988. Support is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Once again, that number is 988.